Okay, so welcome back to the channel, everyone. And today I want to talk about the row because everyone has been talking about a specific story that happened with the row, which we'll definitely get into. Currently in Paris for Paris Fashion Week. This is why I'm in my hotel. It's kind of like a very different setting. But to go straight into the row, I really like the row. I've kind of always been a fan of the row. I think there's a certain customer base and a certain audience for the row. Am I the customer? No. Just because I'm not the customer, does that mean I can't appreciate the brand? Obviously, no as well. So the row is kind of this minimal brand with refined tailoring, relaxed silhouettes. The styling, in my opinion, is what makes it stand out a lot of the time. The color palettes sometimes are really muted. It's one of those brands that's really all about the fit. I kind of call it the Phoebe Philo effect. It creates this sort of cohesive wardrobe for women. It's also ultra expensive, which is why in recent times, the whole, I know, quiet luxury conversation, I feel like that's a taboo phrase at this point, but it's been involved in the quiet luxury conversation a lot because it's one of those, if you know kind of brands. It's minimal, no logos, not many fancy prints. It's really just about, like I said, building a cohesive wardrobe for women. And it was kind of one of those brands that really hit its stride as a replacement to Phoebe Philo's Celine, because Phoebe Philo was gone from fashion for a long time. And what Phoebe Philo did really well was the styling was on point. So many people even wanted to dress like Phoebe Philo herself. It was almost like a style influencer before it was like a big thing to be like a fashion influencer. Like Phoebe Philo was ironically one of the first big fashion influencers influencing her customers. And it kind of fits into that sort of market. And those kind of people, women were looking for a way to, dress in a certain way that doesn't need too much thought. It works cohesively. It always looks chic. You always look classy wearing it. And that is kind of what the row is. Is the stuff overpriced? Yes, it is. Is that an issue? Not really. I mean, there's so many different brands at so many different price points. And I think that the market that they're trying to attract, they can only attract if it has that sort of insane exclusivity from having those prices. Are a lot of the things well made? Yes. Is every single thing that they make well made? No. I have friends who are like big customers of the row and they swear by the row, and they've had complaints with some of the stuff they've worn, but for the most part, everything is well crafted, everything is well made, the fabrics are really good. And something I really love about the row also is the fact that the conversation for the most part is actually around the clothes. When you think of a lot of other brands that are really expensive and at that price point, most of the time we end up talking about, the accessories, the bags, the footwear. There isn't really a focus on the clothes. No one really talks about the tailoring. No one talks about the silhouette. No one talks about the cut, the fit, the styling. I think with the row, that tends to be the bigger focus than the accessories, even though the row has so many successful bags. Off the top of my head, they have like the Idaho, that like really big tote bag. They have the Sophia. I know they have many other bag styles that I'm not remembering now, but the row also does have successful bags, but it seems to me that the focus is on fashion, which I really love, because if you're on a Patreon, in my reviews of the book, How Luxury Lost Its Luster, I always talk about how, a lot of luxury fashion brands went into selling this dream and making you feel a part of that dream. And they have things at every different price point so that you feel like even though you're buying the cheapest bag, you feel like you're one of the row girls, but technically you're not really. So it's always good to see a fashion brand where the focus is mainly on the core product being actual fashion, like the clothes. Now I'm going to read a quote from the Olsen twins from when they had an interview with Net-a-Porter many years ago. So it says, "At the time when we started, we felt like there was no brand creating the core pieces for wardrobe full of designer clothes." And so that just tells you who their market is like the kind of woman that all their clothes are designer, right? But they still want to have a cohesive wardrobe throughout. And that is, going back to Phoebe Philo and Celine, that is what Celine provided at the time. Obviously, a hole was left in the market. Many people have sort of filled that hole in many different ways. We had Daniel Lee at Bottega. Now we have Matteo Blasi at Bottega. We have Peter Do and what Peter Do is doing. And we also have the row. I'm a fan of all three people, all three brands. I like what Matteo Blasi is doing at Bottega. But they're not the same. Like the Bottega aesthetic is a lot more fussy And I don't mean fussy in a bad way, but it's a lot more fussy than the Row. Bottega is not really the kind of brand where you can really build that sort of cohesive wardrobe that they're talking about, a la Phoebe Philo Celine. I think Peter Do is somewhere in the middle, and I think the Row is all the way in that sort of building a cohesive wardrobe for women. So, into the latest thing that happened. In their latest Paris Fashion Week show, they actually sent invites to attendees, and there was a note that was telling attendees that they should not use their phones and they shouldn't be taking pictures and filming things. And at the shows, they were actually given notebooks and pencils instead, and were encouraged to, observe the show firsthand and write things down if they want to make notes. And this, of course, created a massive conversation around elitism and all these kind of themes on social media. And I think there are good arguments for and against it. So I'm really going to go through arguments for it that I agreed with and arguments against it that I agreed with. And I guess at the end, you guys can tell me in the comments what you sort of think about the whole situation and if you agree or disagree with their decision, essentially. So I'm going to start with points in defense of the Row. And I think the first point to consider really is just that I think there's a lot of frustration with a lot of people that, love fashion but can't get to the shows in seeing the shows, and it seems like people aren't really experiencing the clothes or experiencing the show. It's more a big focus on people just wanting to film things, take pictures, create content. It's almost like people aren't present. There's that really viral video of New Year's, I think in Paris, where the vibe was horrible and everyone was just more concerned about filming it on their phones, and everyone had their phones up. It just seemed like a scene from Black Mirror. It was a bit crazy. So I definitely understand where that frustration comes from. So it's quite refreshing that a brand has created a scene where everyone is actually forced into experiencing the show firsthand. They're taking in the music, they're taking in every step, they're taking in all the different things that are happening. They can hear the footsteps of the models, they can see the drape of the clothes, they can see all the finer details that they might not catch. So I really do like that, and that was one of the points made on social media that for the Row making that decision. I also think that doing this is very on brand for the Row. I think if many other brands did this, it would kind of be weird. But for a brand like the Row, if you think about the Olsen twins and you think of the clientele of the Row is kind of like a very if you know kind of brand. Obviously, the people that follow this channel are fashion people. You're into fashion or you're trying to learn about fashion. You've probably heard about the Row, or you know about the Row. You've seen all the shows, when it started, all that sort of stuff. But in general, in the wider sense of, the landscape of fashion brands, mainstream fashion brands especially, the Row is still kind of like that insider, if you know kind of brand. And when you think about that, you think of who the clientele are. These are women that are actresses. These are celebrities. These are people that are the Olsen twins contemporaries, famous people in LA, that sort of vibe. And so there is already this sort of elitist, exclusive, sort of low-key, incognito vibe to the Row anyway. It's always been like that. I've always felt that sort of energy from the brand. And the Olsen twins, they don't go around doing loads and loads of interviews. They are kind of low-key. If you go on YouTube, they don't just have every single show posted on YouTube and on their YouTube channel. It's just not the most accessible brand from all different angles, from price, from actual access, from seeing the clothes, because a lot of stuff isn't posted. Something else they also do is they'll have a runway show, and then when they submit photos to things like Vogue Runway, or they submit pictures to other press, they submit lookbook images, even though there was an actual show, but they don't show you images from the show like a lot of other brands do. They've done that a few times. So there's always that air of, we're different. You're only in if you're in. You only truly know what it's about if you're on the inside. And if you're an outsider, you're kind of just getting half of the message and half of the story. So for that kind of brand to say, please, no phones, no social media, here are some notebooks and pencils, write down your notes, I think is extremely on brand. I was reading the Vogue Runway review, which was written by Mark Holgate, and it was a really interesting because the review actually came out yesterday, but the show happened over a week ago. And normally the reviews come out on the day or at least the day after. I've written for Vogue Runway, and literally we have like a 3-hour deadline from when the show happens to actually submit our words. So the fact that it was so late, I thought that was quite interesting, and I was hoping that, Mark would write about that in the review. And funny enough, Mark did. And so what Mark said is that the show was actually shot in film. And so because obviously it takes time to develop the film and all these things, that's why they didn't have the right images until now, which is why the review came out late. And it actually reminded me in a wider sense of this show almost being about the analog, and actually the Olsen twins wanting there to be a focus on the analog through using film photography, through telling people to use notebooks. It's really a return back to, tangible things, about people really experiencing things through a more slow and considered approach. And it almost creates an experience that is in line with how exclusive the brand is, right? Because it almost harkens back to before the social media age, where if there was a Cristobal Balenciaga show, for example, only the press and the VIPs were the ones that had the privilege to even see what was going on. And if you weren't inside that room, you wouldn't see those images forever. I remember back then, you had to buy like catalogs each per show just to see all the images of all the looks in the collection. Or you could wait for, people to start talking about it in Vogue magazine a month later, or like in Harper's Bazaar. So it kind of creates that elitist vibe where there's, a separation between the haves and the have-nots, which I don't like elitism in fashion, but I think for the row, if I'm being just really objective, not thinking about myself, it makes sense for the row because that is the kind of the vibe of what the row is. And I think the last point I'll make in defense of the row is the fact that this was a very smart marketing strategy. Now, I don't actually know if, they intended for it to be this way or not, but either way, everyone is talking about the row because of this. It was a huge story on social media, on Threads, on X, on Instagram, on TikTok. Everyone was talking about it. And so even going to things being analog and then wanting a focus on analog, it actually ramped up the digital even more, and it ramped up the conversations via digital platforms even more. So yeah, I just find that really interesting. But those are the points in defense of the row. Now I'm going to make point against the row. And then, like I said at the end, you guys can leave comments below and sort of say your piece or share your thoughts. So my first point against what the row did is that, as someone who's a fashion journalist and I attend a lot of fashion shows, I'm at Paris Fashion Week right now, you don't actually truly get a sense of the clothes when you go to a show. I think there's a big misconception because people assume that if you're at the show, it gives you a way better sense of, the clothes, which it kind of does, but not as much as you would think, right? So where it does give you a sense is, so for example, a lot of pictures on Vogue Runway, I feel like because of the way the contrast is or the way the images are colored, sometimes the textures or the fabrics look so different to how you experience them in real life. Like something might be, a really interesting mohair that like bubbles out of the piece, but then when you see it on Vogue Runway, it looks kind of flat. You don't get the sense of the texture of all these pieces like actually flowing out of the garment. So in a way, sometimes the digital kind of takes away from the actual pieces, and also sometimes, going back to color grading, the colors are a bit different when you see them online to seeing them in person. But apart from that, you don't really get a true sense because the models walk by so fast, and depending on the set of the show, sometimes your view might even be blocked unless you're in the front row, which most of the time I'm not in the front row. I'm not that important. So yeah, I don't think you necessarily, you get a sense of the music and you get a sense of the atmosphere, and you can kind of add that when you talk about the clothes. But for the most part, I don't think the experience is super different to watching it online. That's why as a journalist, I always want to go to the showrooms. I actually prefer to go to the showrooms over the show. I actually don't care if I'm not invited to a show, but I'd love to be invited to every showroom, because when you go to the showroom, you actually see all the clothes up close. You can feel the fabrics. You can ask the designer what the actual fabrics are, or the people that work for the brand. You get a proper sense of the collection, and then you can just watch the show back, and then that can kind of give you the atmosphere, and you can kind of put yourself there and kind of feel what the atmosphere is. You see the set, you hear the music, all that sort of stuff. And so that's why I actually really enjoy a lot of influencers taking content at shows, because, and that's also why I like to film things and take pictures at shows. It's not because I'm not experiencing the show, it's actually because when I look back, I might actually be reminded of certain details that I missed the first time when I was looking at the model, because like I said, they just walk past so quickly, you can barely take it in. You only see each look twice. The first time when they walk past, and then obviously in the finale where everyone comes out and then you get to see everything a second time, which also you don't really truly get a sense of all the details in the clothes because so many models are coming all at once and you don't really know what look to fixate your eyes on, and everything is happening so quickly, right? So with every show anyway, I still have to go back and look at the details, look through the show, look at the images, be reminded of certain things. But yeah, I would actually say though, the biggest difference between going to the shows and not going to the shows is when you go to the shows, you get to see the back of the looks. I don't know why, but on social media, Vogue Runway, even a lot of brands, their YouTube videos that they post, it's always from the front view, which is kind of strange and sad because a lot of designers have a lot of interesting details that they put on the back, whether it's, you know, a blazer and the way they, or coat, the way the darting is, or there might be a slit or something interesting, even embellishments on the back, and you just miss that. So I guess that is one advantage of going to the show. But yeah, that's why this whole, the row saying, you know, no social media, no filming, I think it takes away from having a deeper understanding of the clothes and the silhouette and the cut, especially for people who don't have the opportunity to go to the showroom. And that kind of makes it super, super elitist and, dare I say, gatekeepy. They're almost like gatekeeping fashion away from people that are actually passionate about their brand. And yes, okay, cool, they have a customer base in mind. Yes, it's very exclusive, but a lot of people who can't afford the row now will be able to afford the row later. And there are a lot of women and girls who love the row, they love the aesthetic, they just can't afford it now. And you're kind of removing them from the conversation, and these are people that could be future customers. So I think that's kind of an issue there. I think the last point I'll make is that this was not really the intention of the row, or this has nothing to do with the row, but I saw on social media a very elitist air around the takes of the row, and there were just opinions that went along the lines of, yes, I'm so happy, I'm so tired of, you know, all these fashion influencers and these fashion critics and commentators that are all online and this is a return back to real fashion and real art and all that stuff. And to that I say, I find that kind of interesting. Yes, it is kind of cringe when some people genuinely just go to show and they don't experience it in any way, and it's all just about getting content and nothing else. That being said, I really like that social media has democratized, you know, the conversations we have around fashion. I think before, especially before the social media age, the magazines had the narrative, they controlled the narrative, they could steer fashion in any direction that they wanted. And also they had way too much power. You never really want anyone to have a monopoly on anything because they have way too much power. Like Vogue could make or break a fashion designer's career, whereas they can't really do that now, right? So it gives designers more freedom, it gives independent creators more freedom. And also, dare I say that a lot of fashion journalists that I grew up loving, I think a lot of them are really jaded. Not because they're not still good writers. I think a lot of them have been bought out. A lot of them, you know, are paid by these brands now, so they can't be critical really. They've been in the industry too long and built all these relationships that they're scared of, you know, severing by being super, super critical. Then you have obviously the journalists that work for magazines that are sponsored by all of these big brands. And so you don't necessarily get genuine opinions unless you get those from the independent critics. There's quite a few of us on YouTube, for example. I'm sure you guys know many examples and who I'd be talking about. I think this is where the genuine opinions are coming from. I think that when I read opinions on Twitter, I might not agree, but I think it's more raw, which I kind of like. I don't like the overly polished sort of fake PR way that a lot of magazines and established journalists talk about fashion. It's very much like, you know, if they don't like it, they'll be like, and the set was amazing. Did you hear the music, the soundtrack, the the amazing decor, you know, the strings as they played elegantly from the violin. It's so, and they go into this really descriptive way of describing the show without talking about the clothes, which is the whole reason why we're having a runway show in the first place. It's really all about the clothes, but they focus and take our attention away from the clothes because they don't like the show, but they don't want to say that they didn't like the show or explain critically, because these are very intelligent journalists, explain critically why they didn't like the clothing, right? And so, yeah, I just think it's quite funny that everyone was like, oh yeah, this is a return back to real fashion, because what does real fashion mean? Do we want to live in an elitist world or an elitist fashion industry where no one has access to anything unless you go to the shows, and no one sees the images or no one sees any runway apart from if you go to the show? Yeah, I just don't know if that's the most positive conversation to be having around fashion, especially like fashion criticism, because I think that actually social media has done a lot of good in demystifying a lot of the negative trappings, is the best way I can put it, of the fashion industry. But yeah, on that note, thank you very much for watching. Comment down your thoughts below, and I will definitely, I don't normally read most of the comments on videos because I just don't have the time to. I'm always working, but with this video, I'm actually very curious, so I will actually read everyone's comments if you do comment, even if you comment silly things. But yeah, thank you very much for watching. This YouTube channel runs on your support. If you want to support the channel, you can subscribe to my Patreon. You'll gain access to exclusive content that includes everything from my Patreon podcast, where I give a behind-the-scenes insight into the fashion industry, as well as a fashion book club, where I review my favorite fashion books. You can also check out my fashion ebook, which highlights the best fashion journalists to follow, definitions of common fashion terminology, and how to determine what a good source of fashion information is. The links to everything are in the description below.